The first thing that I will say is that these practices and experiences that we call the arts that we engage with are very much integrated into who we are as human beings in the world. And so quite often the kind of experiences that we have with the arts are beyond the kind of cognitive engagement that we're more used to. And it doesn't mean they can't be textual, because I think that there's a place in there for writing as well. However, I would say that what they do is they sort of take a lateral approach to, I don't want to use the term messaging because that's not exactly what I mean, to engagement with people around these issues, so that they get them and comprehend them, apprehend them differently than they would otherwise. So, in other words, a colleague of mine sort of described it as seducing the guard at the gate of the mind. In other words, you can have the job of the guard at the gate of the mind to keep out subversive material that doesn't fit a worldview or a cultural understanding, but the guard can be seduced by familiar forms that contain subversive material. Let's talk about it one way. And so I tend to think of it ultimately as that way, because although there may be overt messaging and there may be practices such as data sonification, data visualization that take things like climate change data, ocean acidification, sea level rise, ocean temperature rise, amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, the amount of CO2 that a tree respires, for example, and make that into something that we can, something we can experience through our senses, so that there it is, things that we don't know. We know they're happening. We intellectually understand that a tree is respiring, but we don't have an experience of that. So it makes visible the invisible, and I guess it makes auditory the inaudible. Also for us, it brings it to our senses in ways that we can have an experience of it.
And what about artworks in and about climate change? Have you had experience with that, or?
I think I was just talking to you the other night about the Helen Meyer Harrison and Newton Harrison's project with David Haley in the UK and in England called Greenhouse Britain, which specifically addressed that. Now, these are large-scale works that are intended as templates to be applied later, but as they they create those, but they also create a conversational space. Wherever they go, they open up a conversational space, and they use various installations. They use these installations to open up that space. So in this case, they had a topographical map of the UK laid out on the floor that was maybe about 3 meters long, and a series of projectors up above would demonstrate on this map where the water would be at different levels of climate warming, how many meters of ocean rise there would be, so that people could see where they live, where their family lives, where their friends live, and see, will it be underwater? How it might be affected by this. And then they propose solutions through their work to these. And that with the understanding that what they're aiming for here is a graceful withdrawal from sea level rise as a strategy.
And have you seen that work live?
I did. I saw that installed at the Centre for Contemporary Art and the Natural World in Devon. Yeah.
And how did you notice how audiences respond, or what kind of reactions that they have, or what kind of impact that kind of work can have on audiences?
Well, what I observed, and I love being a sort of just standing around galleries and watching how people respond to the work, is that they were saying things like, "Oh, look at that! My auntie lives right by there." Things like that, which was great. And other people just feeling like, "Oh, wow, what are we going to do? We live in this floodplain, and we already know it's a floodplain, and it's going to be a flooded floodplain." And they had a sense of it being something they had to do something about. So this is what I was hearing. You know, it wasn't a bunch of abstract information. It suddenly had some visceral reality for them when they could see that visually. And at the same time, the artists opened up these conversations in that space where the work is installed, so that people could come forward with their questions and observations and feedback about and fears and finding opportunities and negative futures is really what we're talking about here. It was really, really interesting because when I first started wanting to do a sort of historic overview of policy impacts of existing and previous works, I found that it was very difficult to find that information. And the reasons for that, as I was discussing with a colleague in the UK, seem to be that in the arts, those kind of questions are not asked in terms of reporting criteria. Not only that, but when something I really believe that unless you're looking at projects that are restorative or bioremedial, like brownfields recovery projects or water restoration projects, which are clearly having an impact, it's always difficult to determine the impact, as you say, of an artist-initiated or arts-led collaborative work or an artwork in this context, because these impacts, I think the reason is that they change, that it happens over time. So, it's very rare for anybody that would be tracking this stuff to think that far ahead in the context of the arts. If that's the way to sort of say it. So not only is it not included in the reporting criteria, it's not looked for either. So that even people who do these works often just move on to another work and don't track outcomes over time. And so my interest is in trying to find a way to track those outcomes over time. I have just recently looked at, and it's great when a project is long-term. I just recently used as a case study a 10-year project out of the West Coast, which was a collaboration with the Squamish Nation. It was called Utsam Witness, and Utsam is the Squamish name for witness, term for witness. And it was centered around aggressive clear-cut logging of an intact old growth forest ecosystem in the Squamish territory, which is unceded territory. And in British Columbia, there's a Forestry Act, and there are specific rules for how one goes about doing forestry. So anyone, not anyone, but a forestry company purchases a tree farm license. So they designate an area as a tree farm license. And then they can go in and cut what they want. And they give the government a fee, which is per tree, which is called stumpage. So that's how the government makes money off of this logging. So in this case, the Squamish Nation were very concerned about logging in their territories. There was some sacred land in there, some places very important to the Squamish. So the outcome of this project, to cut to the chase, which was a 10-year socially engaged project with a bunch, too many activities in workshops involved in it that were arts focused and arts based and engaged to go to detail. But I will say that the basis of it was really simple. You invite people to come up and camp for a weekend in the mountains in this area where the logging was taking place, which is a tremendously beautiful watershed that feeds into the water system of the city of Vancouver. So, and there they would experience Squamish tradition and ceremony and become part of this. And that was very profound. It moved people profoundly. And over the 10 years of the project, 5,000 to 10,000 people participated. And each one of those people was formally involved in a witness ceremony, so that in oral tradition, that is a ceremony in which you become officially a witness. In other words, if you're called upon in future to say what you experienced and saw and witnessed, then you should come forward and speak. So it was the calling forth of these witnesses that in the end stopped the forest company from logging in a very culturally sensitive area. they sort of challenged the Squamish Nation to say, well, who is this important to anyway, right? They said, well, it's important to us. And wait, it's important to all these other people. And here are their voices saying this. So at that point, that opened up a whole space to negotiate with the province that had never happened before. And as a result of that, the province dealt completely differently with the Squamish Nation on this. They dealt with their forestry policy differently. They gave the tree farm license over to the Squamish, saying you should do what you want with this land. And the most of it has been set aside as Wild Spirit Place, and they are sustainably logging a section of it and using the land now, again, as a revival of their cultural traditions in the land.
One of the things I'm interested in, one of the reasons this podcast is called Conscient, is that I'm looking at the how the arts affect people's conscience and the choices that we make in day-to-day life. And right now, with the climate crisis and other sustainability issues, if you want to call it that way, we're not making the right choices, or we're making too many bad choices in terms of the materials we use and the way we transportation and many things, and we're just not aware. And not that the arts necessarily lead to awareness, but my experience has been that when I go into a gallery, when I go to a concert, especially environmental art, which I really enjoy, there's something that happens that brings me much closer. Like the first example you talked about with the sort of biofeedback of the trees. That to me is a way to bring people into an experience that isn't necessarily scientific. It's not about data and this percentage of whatever. It's more sensorial, or it's more, and it might take a long time for it to have impact, but somehow the person is brought into an experience, and that awakening can lead them to change their behavior, and not necessarily. So I don't know. What do you think of that?
Yes, I think so too, and I think sometimes it can be like plein air or Eden 3 are very subtle and lovely, because what they are talking about is that CO2 respiration of trees and bringing those trees a little bit more present for us. But you can also take climate change data, as I think I mentioned, things like temperature rise, sea level acidification, and sonify that data. I've been talking with a seismologist about sonifying the seismic activity around British Columbia, mostly because we want people to take earthquake preparedness seriously. But it's another thing, because that's a way of engaging people, because people really aren't taking it very seriously. And this is a way that they can engage with it, that it becomes, you can even roll it into an iPhone app so that it becomes an enjoyable experience for them to engage with. And then they realize what they really are engaging with is the seismic activity of the place. And so they have an awareness of it all the time that they normally would not have.
In a more playful way.
In a more playful way, And when we were doing the Songbird Project, which is what we mentioned at the beginning, which was, you referred to it, was practice, was we were really looking for ways to have people engage with really big issues and complex issues, which are known kind of colloquially in this world as the world I work in as wicked problems that are really kind of unsolvable in a linear format and are really complex and dynamic. Changing all the time. So sort of perturbations in the world, in natural systems, more than anything else, and how do we respond to those? So, and they're frightening, because when you feel like you have sort of a mastery of nature or control of nature, and suddenly you don't, you really don't, it can be very terrifying for people. And at that time, people were really perceiving environmental, quote, issues as confrontational, and we wanted it to be otherwise.
But there's a place for provocative art. There's a place.
Oh, sure. It's not to say I think that it isn't provocative, but I think it's how, whether or not people become engaged or not. And that doesn't necessarily mean there's no provocation. It isn't all happy at all. You know, these are issues. We're talking about issues, but opening up, finding ways for people to engage in meaningful ways with these really makes a difference, because people can really shut down. They can become depressed and not know how to deal with things. So one of the things that is really powerful and so simple, and we saw this in Witness, is you bring people together for conversations, and then you give them a focus to open up that conversational space. And suddenly this community starts to build around this set of ideas and actions. So as then community can create a vision of where it is they want to go together, that they're committed to. You know, they're not having something foisted on them. So it's a very generative space, and it's kind of like the space that Joseph Boy's legacy has given us as social sculpture, which is how we work with the fabric of the social itself as a transformative practice. There needs to be some kind of long-term thinking in this, because the way I sort of explain it is transformation is slow and often happens in a very subterranean ways. So when you're talking about changing cultures of unsustainability to cultures of sustainability, or making that transformation, what you see at the end is the change. That's really direct, and there it is. There's the change, and it's like a tipping point, and there's the change. But it's that build up to the change and the intervention that is made at critical points in time and in cultures and in cultural knowledge, and interest and concern and awareness. When you make interventions, and sometimes subtle interventions, that are this kind of lateral thinking that I was addressing earlier, is that can start a sort of process that shows up later. You know, and that was the reason I used the Witness Project as an example, was because it started with an intention to end the clear-cut logging, this old-growth forest, and all of these other things came out of it, including the Squamish Nation's 200-year land use plan. And who does a 200-year land use plan? And it's you know, registered with the BC government now. It's brilliant. So all of these things were not foreseen, and what really wasn't foreseen was a revival of the Squamish culture and of Squamish youth on the land doing ceremony again. All of these things came out of it you couldn't foresee, but this was the change, and the change was bigger. Physicist F. David Peat, who sadly passed away fairly recently, had a center in Italy called the Pari Center. And one of his areas that he was interested in discussing as not long before his death was something he called gentle actions, which is a similar kind of thing. It's these kind of subtle interventions that have these long-term effects that build and bring about change. He has a book actually called Gentle Actions that you can look at on that. And then there's other thinking that speaks about this as this kind of silent transformation process. But I think that's something that the arts really do. And the arts are in every culture. And they are, I mean, if you go back to the Chauvet cave paintings, you know, from 39,000 years ago, there's this incredible work. So this way of, I really believe that what we call arts in this culture now, in Western European culture, which there is no name for in many other cultures, or we don't call it art in other cultures, is that its role is to sort of inform, form, and transform the nature of cultures in relation with the world. You know, and I think that's what we're talking about when we're talking about work that addresses the climate crisis.